The gate was an old iron mouth that learned to close at the sound of footsteps. Every payday, men and women lined beneath its chipped sign, Regional Works Department, Payroll Office, holding folders swollen with signatures. Behind the gate, a courtyard baked as if time itself had been set under the sun. Isa was first in line that morning, the calluses on his palms still rimmed with dust from the road he had graded by hand, a stretch of red laterite that stitched 2 villages to the market. He carried a receipt book and a faded badge clipped to his shirt. When the door opened and the clerk called numbers, breath left him in a small, contained way, the way breath leaves a man who has learned to ration hope. He had not been paid for 2 months. His daughter's school had already extended their grace. He had sold his radio. He had not told his mother. Inside, the room smelled of carbon paper and sweaty plastic chairs. A fan trembled overhead, clicking like a metronome for patience. At the window, a glass pane with a small rectangular cutout turned humans into paperwork. Isa slid his badge and contract through the opening, his voice even, his eyes on the ledger where names swam like fish waiting for a net. The clerk glanced, then whispered to a man seated in the shade, an official with a ring that flashed whenever he lifted his hand to his ear to adjust a phone that never left the counter. Mr. Bako, chief of disbursement, wore the kind of calm that could ruin any day. Isa heard his name mouthed on the other side of the pane, saw the ledger close like a lid. "Your file is incomplete," the clerk said, trying not to meet his gaze. "You must bring a fresh attestation from the field engineer in the new form. The green one, not the blue." Isa pressed his palm to the counter. "I brought them last week." The clerk kept her tone soft, ashamed of the script given to her. "Regulations," she said, pointing to a laminated sheet taped to the glass, a lattice of arrows and stamps that looked more maze than policy. Behind her, in a small office, Bako's door stood ajar. The ringed hand turned an empty page and pretended to look for something it had already decided never to find. By noon, the sun shifted and the queue grew tight. A woman somewhere behind Isa began to murmur a prayer. A guard in a fading uniform stood at the gate, his baton tapping the metal rhythmically. Gate, gate, gate. Under a neem tree, 2 mototaxi drivers scrolled WhatsApp, forwarding a voice note about new rules at payroll that asked for a facilitation. Isa listened without trying to listen. He breathed through his teeth and thought of the road, of the straight line he had drawn with a string and stakes, of how honest work looked like a promise through dust. When his turn came again, he asked once more for what he had earned. Bako rose from his office, adjusted his tie, and leaned on the counter. "Let me be clear," he said, voice smooth as stone. "Your contract has a clause, Section 9.3, about advance deductions. You were paid in advance for equipment you did not receive. Therefore, your net is 0 for the period. We'll reconcile next quarter." Isa's eyes moved to the ledger. "Where is it written?" Bako tapped the glass. "In the ledger," he said, "and in the system." The ledger was closed, but it was also everywhere. On paper in an aging computer whose screensaver bounced a logo no longer used, and in the mouths of men who traded certainty for silence. When the guard called the lunch break and swung the gate half shut, Isa felt the door inside him begin to close too. He stayed. He refused to be ventilated out with the heat. He told himself a man can keep a gate open with his breath if he chooses not to surrender it. By evening, the courtyard had thinned. A radio from a nearby stall announced the leader was in the province on an inspection tour. The announcer's baritone mixing ceremony with rumor. Someone said Ibrahim had visited the clinic at dawn and paid a nurse's arrears from his own per diem. Someone else said it was a story, not an act. Isa did not believe in stories until they touched the ledger. He watched the gate. He watched the ring. He watched the clerk who avoided his face. The sun slant through long bars of shadow across the courtyard, so that the ground itself became a prison cell. The guard began to lock up. Isa's breath was steady, but he could feel the bruises forming where the day had leaned on him. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow I come back. And the thought was not resignation, it was an opening. A thin crack of air through which a different sequence might yet be drawn. The next morning the queue started before dawn. Men with thermoses of sweet tea, women with records tucked under their scarves, the murmur of as-salam and inba passing like a current. Isa arrived with the green form, a fresh attestation from the engineer, and photocopies of everything he owned that could be turned into proof. He had borrowed 20,000 francs from a neighbor to purchase the new municipal stamps. The guard looked at the pile of papers and smirked. "Papers have weight," he said, patting his own belly. Isa took his place beneath the neem. Above him a nest the size of a bowl trembled in the branches, threads of ribbon snagged in its thatch. A motorbike coughed in the alley. Inside, a printer woke and began to spit out the day. When the office opened, the choreography repeated, but with a sharper edge. Names were called in clumps. The clerk's voice rose and fell. Baco's ring flashed. Then a man no one recognized slipped ahead of the line, was ushered through the half gate, and disappeared into Baco's office. His shoes were clean, his shirt crisp, his eyes careful. 10 minutes later he emerged pocketing a receipt, his smile the color of new tin. People exchanged looks that needed no language. A whisper war blossomed. Someone said the man was with the service, which was how you named a shadow without getting burned. Someone else said the price had gone up, that even the old codes had been repainted. When Isa's turn came, the clerk examined the new documents with the reverent care of someone handling a child, then slid them reluctantly back under the glass. There was a new checklist, the burgundy form this time, rolled out last night. She did not hold his gaze when she said it. He did not raise his voice. He pointed to the notice board, a rectangle of cork the color of old bread, where a single page had been pinned crookedly at 8:03 a.m., a page that referred to fiscal alignment and batch reconciliation, phrases that fit the mouth like pebbles. Baco appeared again, his tie today a darker stripe, his smile sharpened by practice. You people like to build roads. We build order, he said, and the room's air changed. Asa reached for breath and found a fist. Word traveled. And the roadside tea stall, a young teacher's scrolling telegram read the post aloud. Worker denied salary for want of a burgundy form. How many colors does hunger tolerate? Reactions popped like kernels, angry emojis, prayers, shrugging men. A shopkeeper recorded a voice note to the community group. Count your steps, gate, window office, shadow. Add them up. The sum is 0. An old mason with a white beard said softly, We used to call it the hushed tax, and people nodded because they had paid it too. By noon, a journalist from the local FM station stood outside the gate with a microphone and a stickered recorder. She interviewed a mother who had sold an heirloom bracelet to print a form, a messenger who slept in the yard to keep his place, a junior accountant who would not share her name but shared her fear. It reached Ibrahim by afternoon. He had come to the province to look at a water tower whose pump was down to a cough. He was planning to leave before sunset. In the back of the Land Cruiser, he read the station's caption as it fluttered through on a staffer's screen. The aide beside him, Mariam, the one whose straight spine had made more enemies than statements, watched his face. The leader's jaw did not harden. He did not curse the optics. He closed his eyes for half a breath, the way a man closes a door to open another. Then he asked quietly who was in charge of payroll at Regional Works and whether the gate had locks. At the office, the sun arched its strict circle. A clerk, braver than her uniform indicated, passed Isa a scrap of paper with a number. A counselor, she whispered. He can help you move the ledger. Isa took it between 2 fingers as if it were a live coal. Is this the only way? He asked. She glanced at Baco's office, then at the camera mounted high in the corner that watched the wrong things. She lowered her eyes. I have a brother, she said. He lost his post last year because a batch reconciliation delayed his file. I have learned to survive what I cannot yet fight. Isa folded the paper once, then again until the number became a seed. He did not throw it away. As sunset brushed the gate with copper, the FM journalist wrapped her cable, shook Isa's hand and said, I won't stop the story. He nodded. He took his ledger copy, his badges, his grave silence, and he walked home along the road he had made straight. Behind him, the gate closed with a sound he wished he could forget. Ahead, he did not know a plan had turned in a man's mind and taken the shape of a visit. He did not know the leader had put aside his schedule and looked for a door that they could not refuse. They arrived without sirens, the convoy threading the evening traffic like a thought that has decided itself. The courtyard smelled of warm dust and the sweet metal of the gate. Light from the last of day fell across the notice board, revealing old tape and fresh decrees, a palimpsest of reasons to wait. The guard straightened, baton arrested mid-tap, as the Land Cruiser took its place beneath the neem. Ibrahim stepped down first, jacket folded over his forearm, the kind of quiet that empties a room of excuses. Mariam followed, a slim notebook in her hand, a pen whose cap had been chewed in other battles. No one had sent word ahead. Baco heard the shift in air before he heard the hushed collective intake of breath, and for the first time that week, he looked tired. Ibrahim stood at the threshold and did not move. He watched those who waited. He watched the ledger. He watched the guard whose hand trembled around a ring of keys. Then he did something that shocked the courtyard into stillness. He held the gate and swung it wide, fixing it open with his own body while turning to the crowd as if opening a home to guests. The gate had grown accustomed to closing itself. It tried to return to habit and found instead a hinge that would not obey. The gesture was not grand. It was simply decisive. The message wrote it like a clear bell. People first, door second. Breath before billing. He asked for the chief of disbursement, and Bako came out with a smile he was not sure how to wear. "Welcome," he said, words arranged like furniture. "We were just aligning batches." Ibrahim nodded, already walking to the counter window where the glass cut the world into us and them. He tapped the pane. "A government cannot talk to itself through a wound," he said. Miriam wrote the sentence down, not because it was grand, but because it was true. He turned to the queue. "Who's not been paid for 60 days? Hands rose like a field startled by wind. 90? Fewer, but there were still too many. 120? A woman with a wide brow lifted her hand and lowered it as if testing the sky. He walked to her, then to Isa, whom he had recognized from the story, not by face but by the qualities in his silence. "What is your wage?" Ibrahim asked. Isa named the amount, precise down to the coin, because men keep numbers in their mouths when they cannot keep them in their pockets. "And your work?" "Road grading, Section B, East Stretch." Ibrahim turned to Bako. "Show me the ledger page." Bako hesitated, then retrieved the book, its spine taped, its edges soft with years of handling. He opened to the section and placed it on the counter. Ibrahim did not touch it. He asked the clerk, Kadiatu, her badge said, to read aloud the entries for Isa. She did. Her voice shook at first, then steadied as the act became both testimony and relief. "Advanced deduction for equipment," she read. "Batch reconciliation pending." Clauses that moved like fish in muddy water. Ibrahim listened, then asked a simple question that did not belong to any department. Did anyone breathe before entering these numbers? Did anyone stand where he stands and ask whether hunger can wait for a colored form? Miriam stepped to the notice board and began to unpin and sort the pages. She created 2 columns on the table, law and habit. It was stunning how many rules wore the clothes of the latter. She found the burgundy form. It had never been authorized. She found a WhatsApp printout, a forward from service liaison advising staff to guide claimants to the counselor. She photographed the laminated arrows, their glittering complexity a perfect map to nowhere. She was not angry. She was efficient, and efficiency, when used for mercy, can feel like grace. Ibrahim asked for chairs to be brought out into the courtyard. He sat among the workers, not behind the counter, and that too was a shock. The guards looked for new instructions in the dust. Bako perspired in a ring under his tie. Ibrahim told the queue a rule that was not yet a policy. "From this moment," he said, "we are reversing the order. Work preceded by contract equals wage within 72 hours. Disputes follow after payment, never before. Breath before billing." He paused. "We will verify fraud without using hunger to verify loyalty?" He asked. He'd be left with the ledger for the evening. Bako nodded, relief and dread crossing his face like conflicting winds. Ibrahim stood and handed the ledger to Kadiatu instead. "The book is heavy," he said gently. "Let someone who has carried people carry it." The courtyard laughed then, in a way it had forgotten. A radio crackled at the stall outside, carrying a hymn and a soccer statistic. The gate stayed open. The sky cooled a degree. Ibrahim told Miriam to call for the audit team, not tomorrow, not after a memo, but now, with whoever was in reach. The sun dropped below the buildings and the first star appeared. Ibrahim looked up at it, and down again to the ledger, and back to the people who had waited all day. "Tonight we breathe," he said. "Tomorrow we measure." At dawn the office felt like a room learned too long to whisper. Ibrahim arrived with a small team that looked like clutter until it began to move. Miriam set her notebook and a clean calendar on the table, drawing a line down the middle labeled before and after. A young analyst from the anti-fraud unit carried a portable scanner and a laptop whose stickers were all dates and little slogans about sunlight. A district judge, asked to observe, leaned his cane against the wall and tightened the knot of his light scarf, his eyes holding the humor born of weathering many seasons of paperwork. Kadiatu brought tea and 3 boxes of contractor files no one had asked for in years. Bako stood, unsettled by both the company and the lack of ceremony. The guard had left his baton on a chair, unsure if the old tapping belonged in the new air. They started with artifacts. The ledger was photographed page by page. The camera's click, a small hammer, turning rumor into record. The computer's aging database was mirrored onto an external drive. Its schema mapped, its tables listed. Employees, contracts, advances, reconciliations, exceptions. In the advances table, the analyst found a column labeled Equipment Offset, populated generously for seasonal workers, and dotted rarely for managers. Miriam circled the numbers, then asked the question auditors learned to ask like a reflex. What is missing? Receipts for equipment purchases. Proof of delivery. Signatures of consent. The absence spread across the screen like a spill. They moved to the shelves. In a box labeled Forms, by color they found burgundy forms identical in format to the blue, but stamped with a seal no ministry used. The print shop's address at the bottom was a street that didn't exist. In service liaison chats, forwarded by a junior staffer too tired to be afraid, the team read instructions to route claimants with urgent needs to a private WhatsApp number. Screenshots showed fee schedules for expediting reconciliation. The words were careful, the intent horse-loud. A single thread contained a voice note in which a polite voice explained that the state must tidy its books before it breathes, a sentence whose elegance had cost too many dinners. Ibrahim listened to it and looked at the window where the glass sliced people in two. Miriam drew a flow on the whiteboard. Work performed, contract validated, wage triggered. Over it, she layered the current reality. Work performed, gate, clerk, Baco, liaison, gate again. The diagram looked like a loop designed to tire humans into despair. She wrote the broken mechanism's name where everyone could see it. Prepayment reconciliation with brokered offsets. It sounded legitimate. It was a way to turn dust to gold without burning any fingers. The judge coughed. In the penal code, he said, we have vocabulary for this, but the first remedy is easier than a trial. The remedy is a door. Hisu was asked to sit and retell his steps, not for pity, but for proof. He spread his badges, his green and burgundy forms, his stamped attestations on the desk like a map. Ibrahim asked him for the hour he left for work, the cost of the municipal stamps, the names of the guards he greeted. He gave them all without trembling. Kadiatu added her testimony, calling out the day the new color appeared, the afternoon she'd been told to coach claimants toward a counselor if they looked flexible. Her voice did not shake now. She pointed at the printer, she pointed at the archive, she pointed at Baco's office, and then she pointed at herself. I am part of this net, she said. I want to be part of its undoing. Baco, who had not sat, finally spoke. You do not understand the pressures, he said, and this was true. Funding flows in late, projects shift. I am asked to make the numbers look like promises kept. The equipment advances, what would you call them? Ibrahim did not snap. He did not preach. He asked one question, placed it like a coin. When money is late to the institution, who is allowed to be hungry? The room held its breath. Baco's eyes flickered, not with guilt, but with the weariness of a man who has taught himself to make do. The judge took a small book from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was the Civil Service Code, its edges worn. He opened to a page and read a clause about wages due for labor completed. You can bend practice, he said softly. You cannot bend this without snapping the spine of the state. They built a dossier by noon. Photos of fake forms, database extracts, screenshots from chats, a list of names linked to the liaison, summaries of testimony, the radio clip that had started the intervention. Miriam drafted a brief memo titled Sequence Reversal, which felt like the name of a dance until one understood its cost. In the courtyard, people waited under the neem, and the guard no longer tapped. The gate, propped open with a stone, learned to breathe again. At 2, Ibrahim called a short press moment outside, but without banners. He stood in front of the notice board, the ledger in his hand, and spoke into a single microphone held by the FM journalist who had returned with her recorder and an extra battery. He explained the mechanism, named it without insult, and announced that starting now, wages for completed work would be dispersed before reconciliation, a procedure subject to audit. He invited anyone who had paid a liaison fee to bring receipts to a special desk. He did not promise jail. He promised a line of accountability that began with him and filtered through a wall of glass that would finally be transparent. The crowd did not cheer. It exhaled. The breath sounded like rain on a metal roof just before the dry season breaks. And because he told them how, not just what, tomorrow had already started before this day was finished. By morning, the counter had been moved from behind the glass to the middle of the room, a literal rearrangement that felt like roofs being lowered to keep heat in. The new policy had a name that was not sophisticated because it did not need to be. The 72-hour wage rule. Simple sentence, simple promise. Pay earned wages within 72 hours of verified work. Reconcile later. Never hold a stomach hostage to a stamp. Miriam wrote it on the notice board in block letters and affixed beneath it a small laminated card with 3 metrics that would live on a public chalkboard outside the gate. Door to pay hours, target mostly 2. Denials in last 24 hours, target 0. Complaints resolved this week, target all. The board was mounted beside the neem, where shade could host civics. Funding had to be real, not just a speech. So Ibrahim signed an interim order allowing the Treasury to release a tight, rolling wage float for seasonal workers, replenished weekly as reconciliations caught up. He banned equipment offsets as a precondition for payment. Advances would be handled by procurement against vendor invoices only. not by subtracting from laborers' mouths. The liaison number was shut off by telecom the same afternoon. In its place, a complaint channel went live on 3 paths. A free short code for basic phones, a WhatsApp line staffed by 3 civil servants from outside the department, and a desk manned by Kadiatu in the courtyard, her badge now reading worker support. A 24-hour service level agreement hung over it. Like a promise made at baptism, they drilled it like a fire drill because policy without practice is a story that will forget itself. At 9, they ran a simulation with real documents, real names. ISA submitted his claim at a marked table. A runner carried his file to verification and returned with a stamped slip, work verified. A clerk keyed the wage into the system. The analyst watched the database acknowledge it. The clock ticked. At 40 minutes, ISA received a text on his basic phone with a transaction code and headed to the microfinance window across the street, set up with a handheld terminal that beeped its agreement with the new world. They ran the drill again with 3 claimants at once, then 10. The room found a rhythm and then became it. A contractor arriving late with a truck driver's grievance met the same flow, the same chalkboard, the same 3 metrics counting down their patience, not as a threat, but as a promise. At noon, the board read, door-to-pay average, 64 hours. Pilot. Denials. 0. Complaints resolved. 3. Baco did not disappear. He sat in the second row of the new room while a trainer from the civil service school walked the staff through the clean blueprint. He raised a hand to ask a question not about loopholes, but about failure modes. What happens when the Treasury float delays? He asked. The trainer pointed to a line in the memo. If the float dips, the contingency fund will auto-top from the infrastructure budget's contingency line item, capped and audited weekly. Ibrahim added, out loud, that anyone who tried to reroute this contingency through a private channel would find not just censure, but exposure. He said it quietly, and quiet carried. There was discipline, not spectacle. 2 mid-level staff who had administered the liaison scheme were suspended pending investigation. Their names were not plastered on radio, but they were not shielded either. The print shop owner who had delivered the burgundy forms was summoned to explain himself. The invoices told a story that would have an ending in court, but the heart of the reform was not a purge. It was a habit. Miriam convened Friday culture checks that lasted 30 minutes, where one worker told a story of a time they kept the door open when the habit was to close it. She asked for concrete details. What badge was worn, what stamp was used, what hour was saved. They were small testimonies, and smallness made them replicable. Issa picked up his wages on the second day, receipt torn neatly along the perforation and folded into his ledger copy. A habit he would keep long after the paper turned soft. He shook hands with Kadiatu, who smiled in the calm way of someone who has laid down a heavy bucket without spilling. Outside the gate, a vendor who had watched every day set a new sign above her coolers, Tea for the 72. It was a small joke that felt like a constitution. The radio station updated its story. The headline did not praise a man so much as it named a gate that would not close. In the WhatsApp groups, an image of the chalkboard spread, door-to-pay hours written large enough for anyone to read. The posts were fewer now. When things work, there is less to say. Banks do not change because a sentence is written on a board, so Miriam met with the microfinance co-ops to guarantee liquidity at the edges, where it matters. A memorandum was signed to prevent fees that bite small amounts hardest. The judge began to draft a circular to align the legal vocabulary with the practical one, so that no one could pretend not to understand the rule. Ibrahim visited a week later without cameras. He stood under the neem, looked at the chalkboard, nodded at the numbers, and asked one question of a random claimant about the sequence he had met. The man described it in order, without effort. Ibrahim left content, not triumphant. Systems, like people, show respect by keeping time. A month later, the gate squeaked less when opened. Someone had oiled the hinges. No one could remember when exactly, and that was the point. The chalkboard's hand changed daily, sometimes neat numbers, sometimes crooked. But the headings stayed the same. Ordinary as weather. Door to pay, denials, complaints resolved. Children waiting for parents traced the letters with fingers, learning civic arithmetic through boredom. Inside, the glass pane had been repurposed as a cover for a new bulletin that listed the week's checks and the contact for the complaint desk. People still queued because queues are a country's second language, but the line felt like a path rather than a barrier. The guard kept his baton at his side and had acquired a different habit, answering questions. Other offices took notice. The registry across the street copied the chalkboard, modifying the metric to door to document. The clinic added a counter on its wall, naming it the golden hour for care and using the same breath before billing ethic that had now been written into a provincial directive. A head teacher from the district school came to watch the drill on a Tuesday and left with a photocopied memo, a smile, and a plan to rearrange her admissions desk so that the door became a welcome rather than a test. A bus conductor who doubled as a union man reported on local radio that the culture is changing, not like fireworks, but like water finding its level. No one registered patents on decency. It was too simple, and therefore too strong. The investigation's remnants lived where they should. A case docket at the prosecutor's office, an internal review file that did not require gossip to proceed, a set of anonymized examples for the civil service school that turned abstraction into practice. The liaison scheme would visit a courtroom without ceremony. The print shop would pay a fine, and its owner would have to explain to his sons why a quick invoice can sour a family's name. In the Friday culture checks, a cleaner told the story of a day she watched a new clerk turn someone away for lacking a stapled corner, and how she opened the drawer, handed the young man a staple, and taught him how to make a straight edge. The room laughed, not at, but with. Jokers are different when the joke is on habit. Essa bought back a radio and tuned it every evening at dinner, not to hear men praise powerful people, but to hear the soccer scores and the grain prices and the weather. He walked the road he had graded, which the rains had spared because the camber held, and he watched his daughter tie her school scarf correctly, her fingers learning small order. He kept his receipts in a tin. He told anyone who asked that the ledger now felt like a shared book rather than a lock. He did not use important words. He named objects: gate, chair, stamp, chalk, receipt. Ibrahim's name faded from the daily conversation the way salt dissolves into soup. You know it by the absence of bitterness, not by the recitation of ingredients. He visited once more at dusk and stood under the neem listening to nothing in particular. Miriam briefed him with an economy that came from trust, averages under target, denials rare and corrected, complaints answered within the day more often than not. She mentioned the registry and the clinic copying the board. She mentioned a rumor that someone had tried to revive the liaison under a new pretext, and how the workers themselves shut it down with a photograph of the chalkboard and a text to the short code. He nodded and smiled in that quiet way that belongs to people who prefer a well-run room to applause. On a Tuesday morning, a boy arrived and stood at the gate counting under his breath while his mother filled a form. He counted the seconds from entry to greeting, from greeting to stamp, from stamp to new line. He wasn't doing math. He was creating trust. The guard handed him a piece of chalk, and the boy wrote the day's first number, proud to have participated in something adults pretended was complex. At the end of the week, the chalkboard had a smudge where rain had kissed it. A clerk wiped it and rewrote the numbers without comment. Habit had taken root. Boredom, the holy boredom of good systems, draped itself over the office like a clean sheet. The radio station, after a month, did not update the story. It started a new segment instead called The Door, where citizens called in to report a gate that had learned to stay open. The first caller was a bus driver describing how the transit office stopped demanding a photograph with a specific background color to issue permits, allowing any clear photo and a sworn declaration instead. The second caller was a nurse reporting her ward's new sign, "Treat first, fill later." The third caller was an old mason with a white beard who said simply, "My city has learned to breathe." On paper, the 72-hour wage rule could be repealed by another paper. In practice, it had become a calendar entry in people's heads, and a chalk line that children could redraw if an adult forgot. The door motif, open, then kept open, then expected open, had traveled beyond the payroll office into how food aid moved, how school desks were assigned, how small wrongs were denied, the oxygen they required to become big. No anthem announced the change. Instead, there was the low hum of sorted files, the regular ping of text confirmations, the quieter streets around month's end when men did not feel summoned to anger by a closed window. And in that hum, Isa heard his road speaking, a kind of straightness learning to live inside walls and ledgers too. He kept working. He graded a new stretch toward the river. He paid his daughter's fees. He listened at night to radio and rain, both drumming on roofs in a language he'd always known but had not always been allowed to trust. He had been cheated of his salary once. He had received it not as charity, but as due. The reform had not blessed him. It had respected him. That was the only astonishment that mattered, and in the long run, the only one that lasts. As we close this chapter, remember, just systems are built in the quiet. One open gate, one honest ledger, one kept promise at a time. If this story moved you, carry it forward so more doors stay open and more voices are heard. And if you liked the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe.